tastes like burning.
So last week I talked about achievements and trophies and how they've affected the way that we go back and play older games, and just in general I wanted to talk more about the kind of overall nostalgia that we have for older video games and older movies, and just how either our tastes have evolved or how the medium itself has evolved. Now, with video games, it's one of those things where my generation, we actually grew up with, like, starting with the NES all the way up to where we are now. So we've actually watched video games evolve from, simple 2D platformers all the way up to what we have nowadays, where it's just, it's literally a whole experience instead of just a simple jumping game. But it is one of those things where, because of all the advancements as far as video games, the storytelling, and just the controls and the interactivity, it does make it harder to go back and play those games that we did love whenever we were growing up as kids. There are a lot of games that still hold up well, but there's other games where you go back and play them and it just doesn't have that same sense of wonderment that it did whenever we were playing them, whenever we were just getting into those games, whenever we just went out, bought that game, put it in, and it was the most amazing thing we'd ever seen. And it's one of those things where nowadays you also don't get that same kind of feeling, because there's so much more press about it, so many more videos, so many more reviews, and just overall announcements about games, that we really don't get that sense of amazement that we used to anymore with games. And it is something that I really, really miss. But one of the best examples I can think of to kind of express the differences between what gaming used to be as far as where it is now is Metal Gear Solid 4. And this isn't really spoilers for anyone who still wants to go play the game or anything like that. It's just a small segment, literally only a few minutes, about 3/4 of the way into the game. Doesn't really ruin anything. At one point in the game, you go back to Shadow Moses from the original Metal Gear Solid, which was one of my favorite games on the original PlayStation whenever I first bought it. Let me rephrase that. Whenever my mom first bought it for me, because they wouldn't allow me to buy it because it was rated M. But whenever you're playing Metal Gear Solid 4, all the level of interactivity, all the new game mechanics, the stealth mechanics, the free roam camera, all of a sudden you go back to Shadow Moses, and there's that opening segment where you played in Metal Gear Solid. You play that again with the original game. And it's a wonderful thing to show just how far the games have come, but it also really demonstrated to me just how far gaming has come for me, because I died a lot. I remembered everything about the original opening section of Metal Gear Solid, but going back and playing it with a locked camera, and you can't go into first person, you don't have the tranquilizer gun, all those things really, really affected the way that I played that section, and I died a lot. So much so that when I finally got out of there and it came back to the Metal Gear Solid 4 segment, it was just a huge sigh of relief for me. And this is something where, I do have a lot of games that I love from, let's say the yesteryear. I don't really have a better term for it. But the older generations of games, there are a lot of games that I really do still love. Final Fantasy IX stands out to me most of all. I've played it at least 3 times now, and that game still stands up very, very well nowadays. And there's a lot of PlayStation 2 titles with the same level of interactivity where you do get that whole sense, and it's still, just one of those games where you put it in and it's just amazing to you. Even nowadays, like Shadow of the Colossus or Eco are really just standout games. But then there's other games that you go back and you play, and it's just, compared to what we have now, compared to what we had then, it's something where now that we can have these enormous open environments, no restrictions, no invisible walls, which was the biggest thing back in the older generations, was developers didn't have any real way to stop the player from going to certain sections. So there'd just be this, almost a glass screen in front of the player, stopping you from going in some areas that you either weren't allowed to go yet, or you just couldn't. The biggest problem for me with these was always that my character could do a double jump, jump like 6 feet in the air. There's a 2-foot fence in front of me. I can't jump over it. Stuff like that was just really irritating, and it doesn't exist nowadays. And if it does, the developer is a lot more clever about the way that they hide the fact that you can't go in these other areas or anything like that. They just hide the invisible walls a heck of a lot better than they did back then. But there are a lot of games that do still hold up, but there's a lot of games that don't, and it makes it really, really hard to go back and play those games that you loved as a kid because you've become so accustomed to the way that games are now. And it's really kind of disappointing because I think a lot of people this generation are going to miss out on some really fantastic games that we grew up with, but they're not going to go back and play because it doesn't have all the things that they've grown accustomed to as far as gaming nowadays compared to back then. And I think a lot of that is going to be missed out on whenever we start getting into these new generation of game developers and gaming programmers where they never really had all those games that really got us to where we are now. And I think once we get into those games, it's going to be something where it's kind of missing that special little something that keeps, just the kid in us alive and happy. The other side of this is movies. Movie nostalgia is an entirely different animal because there is different levels of movie nostalgia. There's movie nostalgia where when you were a kid, you watched the movie and it was the most amazing thing you'd ever seen. You would go out in the backyard, reenact the scenes, create your own scenarios. Maybe that was just me. But it's something where there are different levels of nostalgia because you can have the nostalgia where it holds up nowadays and you can still go back and watch it. It's still one of your favorite movies. And then there's another level of nostalgia where you go back and watch it and it's just so bad that it's good, but you don't understand why you loved it so much when you were a kid. There are a lot of movies nowadays that I've gotten into, and you look back on where the movies came from, like especially with all the remakes that are coming out nowadays. I like to go back and try and watch the original before I go and watch the remake just to compare. And there are a surprising amount of movies where, it's not just movie nostalgia, but there are actually movies where it is better than the remake. And I think that's amazing because with all of the technology nowadays and everything that we have available to us, what they did back then is still better than what we could do today with all the computers, all the equipment, all the special effects, and they still surpass. But then there's another side to it where when you were a kid, you absolutely loved this movie. You thought it was one of the coolest things ever, and then you watch it now, and it doesn't really have that same effect on you. Arnold Schwarzenegger's Running Man is a big one for me because I loved it when I was a kid, and don't get me wrong, I still think it's a great movie. It's just as I've grown up and as I've matured, I really can't, let's say, stomach the campiness and especially the one-liners. They don't really pack that same punch for me. But it is something where if The Expendables is a prime example of this, where if you do it right, you can bring that kind of, nostalgia back for those people that grew up with those movies. If you do it right and, you just kind of make an homage to the 80s instead of straight up trying to copy them, like, especially with The Expendables, you have all these amazing actors that a lot of us have grown up with. And the younger generations aren't really going to know who they are, but they still go to this movie and have a good time with it because there's just shit blowing up everywhere. But the people who actually grew up watching these movies, and especially like with Expendables 2, whenever Chuck Norris came in and they just kept referencing his older movies, that was a really great thing for those people of us who actually grew up watching these movies. It's one of those things where as the medium, as movies continue to evolve, and video games especially continue to evolve over a very short amount of time, it's going to be interesting to see just how well the nostalgia of this generation compares to the future generations of both games and movies, just to see how far we've come in such a short amount of time.